Hello everyone, welcome to a new video. Do you have a room in Barcelona that you're planning on renting out? If this is the case and you don't have very clear how to do it or the different options you have, then this video is precisely made for you because that's what I will be covering today. Let's start first with the most important question. Can you rent the room? For this, you need to either be the owner of the property or have a rental contract or agreement with the actual owner saying that it's okay for you to rent that space to a third party. Very often what happens is that between different students, you rent an apartment, let's say between 4 different colleagues, just as an example, but then one decides to leave and you need to look then for a replacement, which maybe you're watching this video and you are in this situation right now. On reasons or motivations for someone to rent a room from their own property, there are of course many, and if you are watching this video right now, I'm sure that you have your own reasons in mind, but very often it is either to make a little extra money or maybe to help cover the cost of living, so that basically living in your own property is for free, or at least it's very cheap that you just need to pay a little bit. Of course, there can also be other reasons, like for instance in terms of security. So imagine that you have a property that you are using, but you travel very often for business purposes, and maybe you just spend 2 days a week in the property and then it stays empty. So maybe for security and just to make sure that someone's always around, that nobody, enters your property and steals things from you, then you decide to rent a room. That said, there are mostly two different options when deciding to rent a room. One of them is to rent it for relatively short periods of time with platforms like, for instance, Airbnb or Booking.com. And the other one is to look for longer-term tenants. Usually it tends to be students or maybe young professionals that have just started their careers. They have junior positions, maybe they are not earning that much money to be able to afford living basically on their own. Pros and cons of each one. Well, for shorter term stays, usually you are able to generate more money because you can charge more than with longer term stays. Also, one of the parts that I like the most is that you are never stuck with another flatmate for a very long period of time when you do, of course, short term stays. Whether you like that person or not, you know that in 1, maybe 2 months or whichever period you're renting the room for, that person will be gone and there will be a new one. This sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. There's sometimes people that you get along very well and then you are sad that they leave, but then on the other hand, there are times in which there are people that maybe you don't get along so well, and then I can tell you that you're super happy when they finally leave. So that's a very positive thing for me. Cons of this, well, you have more work because not only you need to clean the room or apartment more often, but you also need to keep it more tidy in general. And typically when you rent a room through Airbnb or Booking.com, you don't make your guests also do the household chores of your property, while this is something that usually you split when you have longer term tenants. Another pro for longer term stays is pretty obvious, but it is that you don't have to actively be looking for new tenants every month or every 2 weeks, because they typically stay for, let's say, at least 6 months, if not more. And then on cons, firstly, you generally with long-term stays don't earn as much money as with shorter-term stays, as we already mentioned. And also the very big point for me is that if you don't get along with your tenant, then it can become a bit of a nightmare, because it is your own home and you might end up not feeling comfortable at home, and that's a very, very big downside and a huge risk that you have, of course. Not necessarily needs to end up being this way, but that's of course a con, and as I said, a risk that you are also of course willing to take if you decide to go for long-term stays. The next point to consider before making a decision on whether you want to go for short-term or long-term stays is the legal aspect. In Barcelona, unless you have a touristic license for your apartment, which I can tell you that it's extremely hard to get, as the city hall is trying to fight mass tourism, and one of the measures that they implemented was to freeze giving any more touristic licenses for apartments, and I think they haven't given any maybe in the last 6-8 years, maybe even 10. So it's basically almost impossible to get one. If you already have one, then that's great. But what happens is that if you don't have one, you can only rent your room or your whole apartment for periods longer than 31 days. This means 32 days or more. And so regardless of whether you want to do longer term stays or shorter term stays, if you don't have a touristic license, which I would assume that it's most of the apartments in Barcelona, so most likely if you're watching this, your apartment won't have a touristic license, then even if you decide to do, let's say, more shorter term stays, renting it through Airbnb, the minimum that you should rent it for are 32 nights. That said, how do you go exactly about renting a room? Point number 1, decide which kind of tenant you want to have, shorter or longer term stays. This is crucial to know in advance because depending on the type of tenant you want to attract, you will advertise your room in a different platform. For instance, for shorter term stays, I would definitely go for either Airbnb or Booking.com. Please note that I wouldn't advertise the room in both platforms at the same time, or I mean you can do so, but then you risk that if you have the automatic bookings activated, you have overbooking. So maybe that someone at the same time books through Booking.com and Airbnb for the same period, and then you have a very big problem. To solve this, you could have a channel manager, but if you only have one room, this is not something that you can afford, and it would make the whole business really not profitable at all because it's simply not sustainable. If I had to choose from one of these two in Barcelona, I would certainly go for Airbnb. It is super well known. I personally have been using Airbnb for the past 5 years, renting one room in my apartment, and if I want to, I can have my room fully booked the whole year round and I have no problems. For long-term stays, the platforms to advertise your room change. The most popular in Barcelona at the moment are Idealista, Piso Compartido, Buddy or Fotocasa, just to mention a few, but there are many more. And the main difference is that with these platforms, generally you just advertise your room and leave maybe your phone number or your email there, and then people contact you. The payment or things usually don't go through the platform, while it is certainly not the case with Airbnb. Once you have selected the platform, the next point is to take pictures of the room in question and then publish the ad. Make sure to take very nice pictures with good lighting and showing properly the room, as clean of course as possible, and especially this is super important at the beginning when you don't have any reviews, and it can really make a huge difference in the amount of bookings or requests that you get for your room. So really try to take nice pictures. If you can with wide angle, it tends to look nicer, and also it tends to make the room look a bit bigger. So it's always better to attract more people to it. And with the pictures, you then create a profile, add the description, set the price, and you are basically ready to go. For the price of the room, before setting it, just check what your competition is charging. It's as easy as going into the platforms I just mentioned now and trying to search for rooms close to your area or maybe with similar characteristics, and then just using that as a base to put your price. If you see that your apartment is a bit nicer, maybe put it a bit higher. If you see that maybe your room or apartment is not that nice, maybe go a bit lower. Just for some background, for shorter term stays with Airbnb, prices for rooms tend to not go lower than 12 to 15 euros per night, so that's how much I would advise you to charge, although of course there's also a function in Airbnb that recommends the prices that you should set the room at. I would never go for those prices, I would always put something on top of that, but just so you have some reference. And also keep in mind that whatever price you put there, Airbnb will take out 3% from you as a host, and also keep in mind that if you set for instance the room at 15 euros, the guest is also paying a commission on top of that, so maybe if you set it at 15 euros, what the guest will actually be paying to stay with you that night will maybe be 20 euros, not the 15 that you have set it at. And then for longer term stays, typically for prices for a more or less nice apartment and a more or less nice room, again depending on the area, they usually range between 350 to 400 euros per month. Step number 3 is managing the requests or the bookings, and here again I will divide it between short-term stays and long-term stays. For short-term stays, if you are using Airbnb, you can choose to activate the option of automatic bookings or not. If you activate the automatic bookings, imagine that I am just looking for a room in Barcelona, I see one that I like, and I can automatically book it, and that's mine, and I already have the reservation. If you don't want to have that and maybe filter a bit between the different tenants that try to come to your property, then just don't leave that option activated, and every time someone wants to rent your room, they will have to basically make a request, and then you can decide whether you accept it or not. For longer term stays in the platforms I mentioned, typically you just leave the email or your phone number there, and then people contact you. So basically you take the conversation off the platform where you are placing the ad. And then it's very common to just schedule a visit, and then basically the potential tenant comes to your property and then just views the room and sees if she likes it or not. And I would also say that for Barcelona, don't rush into making a decision, because you will have for sure lots of potential tenants when you publish your ad, especially if you use multiple platforms. I mean, probably within one day you will already get more than 50 or 100 requests. And I'm just telling you this from personal experience, also from colleagues or friends that I have. So really, don't rush into making a decision, and it's okay to just have a few potential tenants come by, and don't feel pressured to just accept one. Once you have the tenant confirmed, then comes the payment part. For short-term stays, this is super easy, especially if you do it with platforms like Airbnb that manage the whole payment. So they basically collect it and then they transfer it to you automatically as a host. I think it's after the first night that the person stays at your property, so it's extremely convenient. For long-term stays though, this is a bit more complex because of course you need to sign a contract, usually between both parties, and then it depends on whether you are the owner or not the owner. And then sometimes if you are basically subleasing that apartment, and imagine that you are 4 different friends renting one apartment, typically either they add this new person into the initial contract, or sometimes if the owner trusts you, from my experience, they don't even add you, and maybe just the other 3 that were already in the property stay in that contract, and as long as you pay them, they don't care. The last step is the check-in/moving in part, and for this, in both cases, short and long-term stays, you tend to agree on a time in which you do the check-in and you just welcome the guest. For me, the most important thing at this point is to explain very clearly the rules of the house and how you are planning on establishing the relationship between you as a host and the guest that is coming. For instance, for Airbnb, I typically don't make guests clean the common areas, but with long-term stays, if I'm having someone that will be with me for the foreseeable future, I would agree to split the household chores and just do it like this. And as I said, I would advise to do this at the very beginning of establishing the relationship to avoid any possible conflicts in the future. With everything I mentioned, I hope that the process is more clear now. If you have any questions, which most likely you will have questions, because I know that this video was a bit more general, but to be honest, I didn't want it to be super long. So as I said, feel free to drop the questions below and I will for sure answer them all. If you enjoyed the video, then don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel if you're not yet subscribed. Good luck with renting that room, and as always, see you next time.